With the release of Amphorius, we started to see a noticeable increase in strength for the average Eidolon of a character. And with that, the discussion surrounding a character's strength is starting to assume you have these Eidolons, which will naturally confuse players who are used to pulling only a character at E0 and calling it a day. Now, many people will criticize Star Rail for placing these game-changing abilities through an Eidolon, and while I'm not the biggest fan of it myself, the truth is that this game supports vertical investment more than any other gacha game I've played, as the very high density of available pulls to farm, the ease of farming said pulls, and the oftentimes mediocre strength of light cones makes it far easier to justify pulling these Eidolons in comparison. So then, I think it's important we discuss the Eidolons that are so game-changing that those characters could be considered reliant on them. But before we begin, we're going to need to get a lot of things established, with the biggest one being, what do I mean when I say reliant? Now to explain that, I need you to understand that much of this video will focus on the meta discussions surrounding these characters, and their strength in it. For example, I've noticed that it's a very common occurrence for the average player to hear things like, Tribbie is the most broken character in the game, and they'll then proceed to pull her at E0 as 0, and find her strength to be alright, but definitely not holding up to the hype. On the other hand, they may hear things like, Aglaea is the worst DPS Chrysos heir, but since they have E1, she could end up being their strongest DPS. It's this disparity between the strength of a character in meta discussions and their actual strength on your account that I want to discuss, as many of these kits gain such an insane boost from an early Eidolon that they're arguably an entirely different character. But this is all under the context of their placement in the meta, a concept that has a very loose definition, and something that may not even matter to you. Now I say this because characters who are considered meta are often those who can clear the hardest level of endgame very comfortably, and will consistently have runs at the highest level of play, that being 0 cycles. But the requirements necessary to get the bare minimum to clear the endgame content are grossly overestimated in this game, as almost everyone that I'll talk about in this list can clear endgame content within the general 5 cycle requirements, with the right teams. I bring this all up because there's often a big difference between the strength of a character in the meta and how they're played on the average account. And since much of my content focuses on meta, I don't want to give the wrong idea to people. I think the best example of this is with someone like Anaxa, who is one of the strongest DPS, and is often the cheapest. However, he's one of the strongest because his one meta team, a sustainless composition, has very high synergy and has high skill expression. But to the average Anaxa player, who is adamant in using a sustain, like Dipped, he's not considered a meta DPS at that level of play, unless Irene is at E2. So, just keep in mind, there are countless examples like this for every DPS, where the way you play them, and how they're assessed in the meta, are very different. Circling back to the term reliant though, I want to make it clear that my definition of a character being Eidolon-Reliant may differ from yours. I say this because I can easily see people being more lenient to some characters that I mention, while others may believe some characters should join the list. So, I actively encourage you to think about whether you agree with my picks, and find your own reasons as to why you think that. Perhaps we could have a discussion on it in the comments. With that established, we should probably start with Tribbie Z1, since she's running on the second half of 4.2, and many people might be considering grabbing it if they haven't already. Now the funny thing with Tribbie E1 is that reading it sells its power short. By a lot. I say this because it says that you deal 24% true damage, but the way it does so could end up resulting in you dealing upwards of 3 times more effective damage. Now, the term effective damage is very important there, because her E1 allows you to essentially steal the damage that was wasted on random enemies, and consolidate that damage to the target that actually matters. To explain what I mean, let's assume you're in a fight like Hule, and he spawns his tiny wolves that don't really do anything. Now to keep things simple, let's assume you're about to do a full AoE attack, and you're going to do 1 damage to each of them. Now, what Tribbie E1 does is that it looks at the total damage you did in the top right, takes 24% of that damage, and drops it on the target with the highest HP, which is almost always the boss. So in this example, even though you did 1 damage to Hule, Tribbie's E1 saw that you did 5 damage in total, takes 24% of that, rounded to the nearest full number, so 2 in this example, and drops it on Hule. So you ended up tripling your effective damage by taking that wasted damage from his spawns and directing it towards the enemy that matters. What's even crazier is that Tribbie's E1 takes into account overflow damage, since again, it just looks at the number in the top right and drops 24% of it to the target. In truth, her E1 is strong enough to be the whole kit of a character. And I can pretty confidently say this because it already happened with Cypher. Now, the whole identity of Cypher's kit is to store the damage that you've dealt, and then to cash out that damage onto the target. The sad part about that, though, is while they both end up doing the same thing, Cypher does it in a very honest way, whereas Tribbie's E1 is very dishonest. I say this because Cypher looks at the HP lost from the enemies on field, and then stores that damage to ideally be used in one big burst at the end of a fight. However, Tribbie's E1 is very lazy and just looks at the final number after an attack, which is how it can account for the overflow damage you've dealt, whereas Cypher cannot. It's for this reason that you'll see E1 Tribbie overperform in every AoE scenario, as fights like Nikador, Flame Reaver, and Lygus can be trivialized by her. Now, the truth is that outside of her E1, her base kit can be summed up as a marginal improvement to Roan Mei that can spam DDD very effectively. And while that's still pretty decent, her lack of a clear best-in-slot team and lackluster damage contributions at an E0 S0 level have led to a noticeable decline in use as teams continue gaining dedicated supports. However, at E1, her incredible performance in AoE fights and overall utility has led to a continuous use in almost any team, even though she's been out for over a year. But now we can turn our attention to the guy who arguably has the highest Eidolon-Reliance in the game, and who truthfully inspired this video in the first place, Phainon. Now online, you'll hear a lot of discussions centered around Phainon, and how he's one of the best DPS in the game. Then at the same time, you'll hear that he's one of the worst aging DPS, and has some of the worst performance out of all of the version 3 DPS. The unfortunate truth is that both of these statements are true, depending on which Eidolon you're at. And trust me, nobody's more upset about that than me. Now regarding his E0 kit, Phainon is unfortunately one of the most restricting DPS in the game, as his actions are tied to very specific points of a cycle, and cannot be altered by teammates, since they're kicked out of the battle. Furthermore, his gameplay loop during his ultimate form is focused on charging Scourge stacks until you can unlock his Meteor ability, and aligning the moment of dropping the Meteor when the enemy is most vulnerable. However, at E0, he oftentimes lacks enough actions and enough damage to drop his Meteor at ideal moments of the fight, which sucks a lot as his Meteor is a bounce type attack, which scales very well in single target, but horribly in AoE. So to summarize, at E0 he has very few actions available, even less flexibility during those actions, as you'll oftentimes lose a Meteor if you mismanage your stack generation, and very little skill expression. Then at E2, literally all of these issues get fixed, as 20% res pen is very helpful for reaching damage breakpoints in fights. The extra turns help dramatically with flexibility and aligning Meteor drops at correct times, and the fact that those extra actions are tied to the Meteor heavily rewards you for correctly managing his resources. Truthfully, Phainon feels like the biggest example of creating a problem and selling the solution that Hoyo has done thus far, and has led to a lot of differing opinions on his strength, depending on whether you bought the solution or not. What's worse is that if you look at things through a strictly meta perspective, it would be wiser to replace E0 Phainon with Anaxa, as Anaxa uses his best teammates, but just performs better. But while I say this, I need to remind you of the 3-minute disclaimer I made a few moments ago, as Phainon at E0 can still clear content. He's just not someone that would typically be defined as a meta at E0. Not only that, but at E2, he's still among the strongest DPS in the game, with no real sign of this changing. Then the last character, whom I'd argue is Eidolon-Reliant, is Aglaea, but for a very depressing reason. Now, many people are aware of how strong Aglaea's E1 is, as her biggest issue is her extremely high ultimate cost, so the additional energy from her E1 will make her feel far better to play, as you no longer have the threat of losing her uptime looming over you. Not only that, but getting her ultimate more frequently will result in even more actions, which, in combination with the 15% vulnerability debuff it applies, will result in a very large damage increase as well. All of this is very strong numerically, and makes it feel better to play. But if that was all there was to it, then I wouldn't define her as being Eidolon-Reliant. No. What makes this Eidolon so important for her is that it makes it far easier to drop Sunday in her team. Now, your initial thought is probably, but I thought Sunday was made for her. Why would you want to drop him? And while it's true that he has some synergy with her, he also has very noticeable anti-synergy with her too. The issue with Sunday, or Veronica, is that you really want to play them in -1 speed setups. However, Aglaea is the fastest DPS in the game, so it's virtually impossible to perfectly align Sunday to be right before Aglaea with every action. As a result, it's often recommended to build Aglaea at 0 speed and Sunday with very high speed, just to keep them aligned. And ignoring the fact that most of Aglaea's kit is screaming at you to build speed, this still isn't a perfect solution, as you will lose out on a lot of action value no matter what you do, with it only getting worse the longer the fight goes. Then there's also the problem of buff uptime, as the skill buff is a 2-turn buff applied to the target, instead of an aura buff, for whatever reason. As such, during fights that give her a free turn, or whenever she needs to ult, there's a good chance you'll lose buff uptime for a turn, which hurts even more if you have Sunday E1. But at E0 Aglaea, Sunday is still recommended to be used in spite of everything, and that's mostly because the energy is pivotal. Now, the release of Cyrene helped a lot in this regard, but at E0 you're still quite starved for energy, so Sunday will still see use. However, at E1 you're finally free from the shackles of Sunday, which lets you use a support that actually has synergy. Funnily enough, this often leads to Tribbie being the best option, as Aglaea's joint attacks provide more energy for Tribbie than most other DPS, and Aglaea benefits greatly from DDD, as its 24% action advance is far better and easier to manage for a speedy DPS like herself. Now, those three are the only characters that I define as being Eidolon-Reliant, but there are probably a lot of people out there shocked by the omission of a few characters. But what I want to make very clear is that these three characters are reliant on those Eidolons to truly be meta, whereas other characters with similarly strong Eidolons don't need their strong Eidolons to still be considered meta. So, things like Hyceelan's E1, Archer E1, Firefly E2, and Cyrene E2. While strong, the strength of these characters at E0 are strong enough. For now. Now, the truth is that this game rewards vertical investment a lot, so if you want to play these characters long term, you'll probably need to pick up some of these Eidolons for them to stay meta. However, for now, these characters at E0 are strong enough to stay near the top. And for those who are interested in Evanescia, she's looking to be another addition to this list, but keep in mind that her E1 is the strongest DPS E1 in the game now, and many discussions surrounding her will likely be with her E1 in mind, as it's far more efficient to grab her at E1 as 0 than E0 S1. So with all of that being said, it's time to answer the last question. Are they necessary? Well, that'll entirely depend on what matters to you. If you're someone like me, who centers on meta and getting 0 cycles with characters you like, yeah, you'll probably need them. Not necessarily because these characters need these Eidolons to perform, but because the limit of these characters can't reasonably be pushed without them. However, if you're just looking to clear, these characters can likely all do it at E0. This game is far easier to grab all the endgame rewards than the internet will lead you to believe, as for some reason, unknown to me, 0 cycles has become the metric to gauge whether a character is strong. And while everything that I discussed was in the context of their meta performance, which does include performance in 0 cycles, there's a very high chance that everything I said doesn't apply to you, since most people don't play that way. If you're truthfully worried that you may have bricked your account because of how you invested, just know that any mistake can be fixed, and any account can be salvaged. I'll be honest, my frustration towards E0 Phainon mostly inspired this video, as I'm not sure if I'll ever get over how disappointing he is at that level. And trust me, I've unfortunately played a lot of E0 Phainon. But that passion led to a very interesting video topic, so I suppose I can thank him for that. And honestly, do let me know about others that you'd consider to be Eidolon dependent. Do you think I was too lenient to characters like High Ceilings or Veronica? Because I can easily see the argument that they should join the other 3. I just haven't been convinced yet. Anyways though, bye-bye!